Good afternoon, ladies and gentlemen. First of all, I want to thank Professor Seminatore for your kind invitation and for having me as a speaker. I am very honored with the opportunity to address such a distinguished audience, and I very much want to apologize that I cannot be physically present as I'm currently in Seoul for research. At the very moment, I'm in another conference, which explains why I've recorded my presentation. So apologies again. I hope the quality of the recording is good, and I promise that I'll be a good host for any of you who would like to visit Korea in the coming months. And for those of you who have already been here or who are familiar with the country, they probably already know that Korean cuisine very much approaches the burning effect of the topic that we are discussing today, that is cyber war. So let me introduce myself. I'm a PhD candidate at the Free University of Brussels, and currently I'm visiting Korea University in South Korea, in Seoul. My research is on cyber war, cybersecurity, and cybercrime, and more particularly on the challenges that international hacking incidents pose to public international law and criminal law. The aim of my presentation of today is to show that there is a need for more international collaboration in holding the responsible private and public actors to account. As you all know, on the 9th of April, the French television network TV5 Monde was the victim of a cyber attack by individuals claiming to belong to the terrorist group Islamic State. The French prosecutor described the incident as cyber terrorism and therefore opened a terrorism investigation. The attack against TV5 Monde reminds me somehow of the attack against Belgacom. As we all know, Belgacom is Belgium's largest telecommunication provider, and in 2013 it surprisingly discovered a virus infection within its subsidiary BICS. BICS offers carrier services to telecommunications companies all over the world. A first similarity with the TV5 Monde case is that a remote administration tool was used to access deeper levels of Belgacom's network. A second similarity is that the Belgian prosecutors opened an investigation and referred to the incident as state-sponsored cyber espionage. An important difference between the two cases, however, is that nobody at all claimed responsibility for the attack against Belgacom. Initially, the Belgian newspaper De Standaard referred to the involvement of the US National Security Agency. But at the end of 2014, it referred to Snowden documents showing that the British government communications headquarters would have been behind the attack. Now, aside from cases in which a private or public actor claims responsibility for a cyber attack, there are also situations in which the real responsible is very hard to identify. An interesting case concerns the cyber attacks by pro-Russian hacking groups during the conflict between Russia and Ukraine. For instance, CYBER-GUERRE assumed responsibility for several cyber operations, such as against NATO, the vote counting system that was used for the Ukrainian elections, as well as a mobile of a member of the delegation of US Vice President Joe Biden during a visit they paid to Ukraine. Although CYBER-GUERRE never mentioned any support by Russia, several security companies found Russian roots in a number of malwares, not necessarily made or created by CYBER-GUERRE, but perhaps by one of the other cybercrime gangs that launched attacks against the Ukrainian government and neighboring countries. The UK security company BAE Systems, for instance, observed that the malware Snake was coded in Russian and used from within the Moscow time zone against Ukrainian computer systems. Media reports later also added that Snake would have been used against the Belgian Ministry of Foreign Affairs to access documents in relation to the crisis in Ukraine. The media and security companies, however, never explicitly attributed cyber operations to Russia, and in fact, it is also very difficult to apply the rules on state responsibility to cyber operations by private actors. In 2013, NATO requested a group of experts to develop a Tallinn manual on the international law applicable to cyber warfare. The manual addresses legal issues such as sovereignty, jurisdiction, state responsibility, and the law of war. But most important for our discussion of today is that the manual considers how the articles on state responsibility translate to the cyber context. So now we'll follow a rather dry legal analysis of how cyber conduct by private actors may be attributed to a state on the basis of the articles on state responsibility. Article 5 of the Articles on State Responsibility provides that if a person or an entity exercises elements of governmental control, given that it is empowered by law to do so, then its conduct will be considered an act of the state on the international law. The Talon Manual refers, for instance, to a private entity empowered to undertake cyber intelligence, or still a private corporation authorized by a state to conduct offensive computer network operations against another state. Now, if we apply these rules to the case of the Ukraine-Russia conflict, then we may have to conclude that empowerment or authorization by Russia is lacking. Article 8 of the Articles on State Responsibility provides that the conduct of a person or a group of persons acting on the instructions, direction or control of a state shall also be considered an act of state under international law. The Talon Manual says that hacktivists or patriotic actors that act on their own initiative do not fall under Article 8. But this exception may perhaps apply to CYBER-GUERRE, but not necessarily to the more profit-driven cybercrime gangs. But in any case, it remains very difficult to prove effective control by Russia over these groups. The Talon Manual says that effective control has to go beyond the mere encouragement and the mere provision of hacking tools by a state. Instead, it has to be established that the state provides an organized group with malware and training to carry out cyber attacks against another state. In other words, the states need to intervene in the targeting by the private actors in order to be able to attribute the conduct of these actors to the state on the basis of Article 8 of the Articles on State Responsibility. Finally, Article 11 of the Articles on State Responsibility refers to the acknowledgement and adoption by a state of the conduct by private actors as its own. Here the Talon Manual refers to support by a state of non-state actors who conduct cyber operations against another state. But to my knowledge, to date Russia has not yet publicly supported cyber operations by private actors in its conflict with Ukraine. Having said that, it becomes clear and imperative that we have to be more and more concerned about the cyber capabilities of private actors. During the past months, Islamic State has shocked the international community with its atrocities against persons and institutions in the offline world. But if IS would follow the same cruel logic in the online world and would further employ and professionalize its so-called hacking division, then states may have to get even more prepared for attacks against their critical infrastructure and for serious human rights violations in the online world. The cyber attack against TV5 Monde, in fact, was the first one of such a significant scale following a few relatively smaller cyber attacks over the past months, such as against a US television station and the US news magazine. I'll limit the remaining part of my presentation to the reactions of a few global actors to these hacking incidents. This is work in progress, so I reserve any final conclusions for my later work, in which I will also further analyze the responses of the European Union and the states. A first thing to note is that the experts of the Talon Manual are now working on a second version of the manual, which will further explore, amongst other things, sovereignty in a cyber context. This approach is, of course, an example of good practice of more international collaboration to discuss the limits to acceptable cyber behavior and also, hopefully, to discuss the limits to law enforcement on the internet. Nevertheless, a truly global approach would imply that Russia and other major economies are also included as experts in the drafting of the manual. For instance, just as the United States hosts the world's largest high-tech corporation, South Korea can be seen as the most wired nation in the world, and India as a host of the world's top IT outsourcing companies. The new version of the manual will also examine cybersecurity threats under other fields of law, such as human rights law. And this seems to echo a call for changing focus from attempts to attribute private cyber operations to a state to a focus on state failures to prevent cyber conduct by private actors. For instance, Rule 5 of the Talon Manual provides that the state shall not knowingly allow the cyber infrastructure on its territory or under its exclusive governmental control to be used for acts that adversely and unlawfully affect other states. This rule is a clear reference to the Corfu Channel judgment of the International Court of Justice of 1948, in which the ICJ held that a state may not knowingly allow its territory to be used for acts contrary to the rights of other states. Earlier this month, Fatou Bensouda, the prosecutor of the International Criminal Court, said that it cannot open a preliminary examination of the human rights violations by Islamic states, as states first have to identify the most responsible persons within IS themselves. The International Criminal Court has thus passed the ball back to the state level, and I'm looking forward how states will tackle the issues at stake. How will they find the responsible? Will they cooperate in doing so? There's still many more questions on the table, but in any case, the accession to the Council of Europe's Cybercrime Convention, for instance, would in any case already be a valuable step in realizing more cooperation between countries. That was all from my side. Thank you very much for your attention, and I look forward to following the discussion later on. Thank you.